Hey, everybody. I'm Austin Baker.
And I'm Doug Beanstalk.
And welcome back to State of the Hack. It's been a while since we last talked to you, and we have a great episode for you today. We have a very special guest, but before we get into that, we're of course going to start with the topics of the day and do a quick run through on things you should know about that you've been seeing in the news. And to no one's surprise and to everyone's chagrin, ransomware, which we talked about you back in October, is still very much in the headlines. Although, interestingly enough, we actually have a somewhat new player on the scene that's caught a lot of headlines. Doug, maybe take a second, introduce us.
Yeah, so we're talking about eGregor today, which is another ransomware variant that we've been seeing pop up on the scene lately. Interestingly, it's not like a brand new malware family. It's a kind of revamp or rehash of a malware family, or I should say an encryptor family that we've previously tracked as SecMet. But they've made a few changes, and it's now going around as eGregor, and that's the name that they are using in their ransom notes. Austin, any particular details on this actor or like their TTPs that we want to kind of quickly highlight?
Yeah, so it's interesting because they've hit the news quite frequently now. They've got a lot of big targets under their belt already, big corporations, Barnes & Noble, Kmart, even one of the transit systems in Canada. Yeah. And they've made a big splash because in the most recent events, as we saw from the news, there's printers printing off copies of the text file ransom note to go along with all the other activity. So definitely an interesting set of campaigns. However, one of the things that we noted and are still kind of digging into is that the eGregor group is not just one group. It's in fact an affiliate program, a ransomware as a service type affiliate program that has several different threat actors that are all using this sort of new version of the eGregor ransomware. So we have to be careful not to conflate every single incident with eGregor ransomware with the individuals that own and operate the name and shame site that's been leaking files. So very interesting. We've got our eyes kind of kept glued to the screen there, as does everyone else in the security community, to see who gets added and what new techniques they're bringing to the table. But it's been very interesting to watch, to say the least.
A never-ending cycle, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. And the last thing I did want to mention, and this is more in the soft side of cybersecurity news. So those of you in the community know that there's been a lot of discussion recently about offensive security tools and ethical ways to release those so that you can respect sort of the defensive side. Obviously, we can't go into that now as much as I would love to, just because that's a whole separate topic for its own episode. However, I had the benefit of watching a phenomenal keynote speech by Matthew Graber, who's a longtime member of this community, very beloved member of this community. But if you have not heard of this discussion about offensive security tools and research, or if you have and you have a very strong opinion on it, please do yourself a favor, watch Matt's talk. I'll include it in a tweet when this episode releases. It's a very thoughtful, very careful dissection and reframing of the issue. I loved it. It really impacted me, definitely caused me to reconsider a lot of my strongly held opinions. And I hope that it will do the same for you. So again, please check it out. I think it's for the benefit of the community as a whole. So that's just the quick plug there.
All right. So on to the main event. We had a little bit of a Twitter poll earlier in the year, I think maybe a few weeks ago, about, what should we talk about on the next State of the Hack? And we really want State of the Hack to be something that everyone can engage with, right? Where it's only an interesting podcast if you, the audience, says so. We had a lot of great feedback, and by a pretty overwhelming margin, there was a lot of people who wanted us to talk about Office 365 and some of those more advanced attacks, right? I think everyone in the security community is probably aware of business email compromise, and I'll call those kind of the low-hanging fruit attacks, but there's not as much focus on the really high-value stuff or the types of methodologies that maybe a Apex actor or a nation-state actor would use. So I'm really excited about today's topic. It's a research topic close to my heart, as well as our special guest. We are really excited to have Dirk-Jan Mollema on our podcast. I hope everyone has read or heard some of his talks. He was one of MSRC's most valuable researchers. A lot of awesome tools that have been released, like PrivXchange, Road Tools, Road Recon. He's currently in the Netherlands and working for Foxit. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So really quickly, you've contributed a lot of research to the security community. How did you get interested in Azure Active Directory to start with?
I think it started about 2 years ago. I hadn't really looked much at Azure or cloud stuff or Office 365. And then suddenly we were at the client and they were like, okay, can you hack the CEO's mailbox for us?
Right.
So I was like, well, probably can, but I have no idea how this all works and how it all fits together. And so we started hacking their internal network and then got domain admin, as we often do.
Right.
And then we had to move to the cloud because his mailbox was in Office 365. And eventually I ended up finding a way to go from on-prem to the cloud. And I was like, okay, well, there's a lot of things here and not a lot documented. So not a lot of people have been looking into this. There's a lot of area for new research. And I just kind of started digging into it more, found some interesting stuff. And I think it's first time this year that it's really getting a lot of attention, especially Azure AD security with a lot of new tools being released, plenty of people writing blogs, now also Bloodhound supporting Azure AD. So it's gaining traction now, but with everything in security, I think sometimes security is ahead and sometimes security is behind. And I think in this case, the offensive community especially was definitely behind because businesses have been using Office 365 and Azure AD for years. And the amount of documented attacks and stuff on it, it was just so low. And it's getting better now, so that's good.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It was really interesting when I was doing red teams to all of a sudden I feel like Office 365 was just there. And maybe there was like some sort of critical mass with companies adopting it. But yeah, when I started looking at it as well, you're like, oh, this has been around for a long time. Like, why are we just getting to it? It'll be really interesting to see with the new Bloodhound supporting Azure AD. A lot of interesting things I'm sure will be found.
Yeah, that's right. The new release. So one question I have for just the benefit of those watching that don't know, but what is the MSRC Most Valuable Researcher? What is that designation? Tell us a little bit about how you went about actually getting that kind of special designation.
So if you do a lot of research and you send a lot of vulnerabilities to MSRC, for each vulnerability that you send in, based on the criticality, they award you a certain amount of points. And I think and that gets you certain. So if you're in the top 50th percentile on points based or in the top 25 percentile with impact. So if you submit a few very high risk vulnerabilities or you submit a lot of medium to high risk vulnerabilities, then you get on that list. And I just happened to send it enough 2 years in a row to make it there. So
I mean, that's a pretty special accomplishment. And kind of on behalf of the general security community, I just want to say, obviously, thank you for being very diligent about working with Microsoft on these issues, because obviously it's one thing to find them, but it's another thing to actually dedicate the time to helping them identify and fix the underlying problems. So, before we move on to the actual meat, definitely thank you for your effort on that. It's been really interesting to watch that develop, the new concerns and a lot of the effort that Microsoft has been putting on Azure AD in particular, in terms of adding the necessary guardrails and protections and isolations that previously weren't there. So I am sure you had a lot to do with that. So thank you.
Well, I know they read my blogs as well.
If they're smart, they definitely do. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, so let's talk about those blogs. Specifically, one of the techniques that you've kind of talked about a lot over the summer and recently is the primary refresh token and stealing that primary refresh token off of Azure AD joined or hybrid AD joined devices. So you want to give us a little bit of background, like what is that primary refresh token and what does it mean for a user and a threat actor or a red teamer?
So if we go back a bit to the old school on-prem Active Directory, the idea is that you sign in once to your Windows device, you start doing your work, and whatever you try to access from there, you get signed in automatically, and you don't have to enter your password 50 times a day.
Right.
Because entering your password 50 times a day sure doesn't make you pick a very strong password. And it's just, it's just annoying, and you don't want to be doing that. So in Active Directory, there was already single sign-on using the protocols NTLM and Kerberos. A lot of stuff written about it, a lot of research done about it, and that also transferred to Azure AD. So Azure AD is really the identity part of Azure, and a lot of people confuse it with, I have my VMs in Azure. Is that the same as Azure AD? Well, it's connected. Everything is connected, but Azure AD is primarily the identity part. And of course, you sign in there, and you can do that as well when your workstation is joined to Azure AD. And then you just, from there, you can automatically sign in to cloud applications that are connected to Azure AD. And it all happens magically with single sign-on. And the interesting thing was, always when there is some sort of single sign-on, that means that if you have access to that device as an attacker, you can kind of lift on that single sign-on and use it as well. And that's something that you already see in Active Directory. If you have a session and you have attackers have a beacon or a remote shell, they can just kind of connect to something, and then Windows will automatically add the login credentials to the website you're trying to visit, for example.
Interesting.
That's the same with Azure AD. So the primary refresh token is a bit of cryptographic, secured and signed piece of identity that you get when you sign in on an Azure AD joint machine, and that's used to generate the cryptographic proof that you are you, and it's tied to your identity, and it allows you to sign in without your computer having to remember your plaintext password all the time.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously the first question, and I'm assuming it's probably the first question most red teamers ask when they discover some sort of new documentation on Microsoft Block somewhere. Why does an attacker care about the PRT? What makes it unique? What unique benefits does it offer to an attacker? Why take the extra effort to go after it as opposed to just, say, dumping their hashes or something like that, right?
Yeah, so it kind of starts with cloud security in general, and you're very familiar with business email compromise. How they usually start is they just spray a lot of different passwords to a cloud environment. If you have enough people in the company, always someone uses the less strong passwords, and you get in, and then you have access to that account. Now, there are obviously ways to secure that, like with MFA or even stronger policies. And if you have really strict policies, you can even set that you can only sign in, for example, to your account from a company managed device that's joined to Azure AD, and that's compliant with all of the policies. It has to have the latest updates installed and whatnot. And at that point, then you can't just sign in to an account using only its password, and sometimes not even if you have the MFA token. So then, if you have really advanced security or you're protecting high privileged accounts, then you have to go back to the point where the account is allowed to sign in. So if you have strict policies and you require a device that joins to Azure AD, you need, as a red teamer or an attacker, to obtain access to that device. And then you suddenly are in that environment that's trusted, and you can access the resources that you want to access.
Right. And I was reading the documentation for that in your blog, and there's a lot of talk about TPMs and cryptographic security with TPMs. And, as a red teamer myself, a lot of the times when I read the documentation and I see, this is stored in the TPM, like, the boot key is stored in the TPM. Usually that's like, all right, well, it's game over for that attack. It's in the TPM. I'm not going to be able to get it. But it seems like in this case, you and Gentle Kiwi and some others working together, you found that that's actually not the case here. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Because, usually TPM, most people and administrators too, they're probably assume that they're safe, right?
Yeah, you'd think that. And TPM has a really specific kind of protection.
Yeah.
And it really protects those cryptographic keys, but it still means that if you're on the device itself, you can perform operations on these cryptographic keys by just asking the TPM nicely. Just taking a step back to that documentation base, because I've read that one I don't know how many times. I've read it so many times.
Yeah.
And when you read it the first time, you think, oh, this is secured here. This is secured in TPM. It's all hardware protected. Oh, this sounds amazing.
Right.
And then when you really start digging into it, so you look at the single sign-on, how it works, and you start even reversing a little bit, and then you suddenly think, okay, but it doesn't protect against some very specific attacks. And then you read the documentation again, and then you suddenly realize it doesn't strictly say that it protects against these attacks. You just inferred that because there's so much talk about hardware security and
Right.
being tied to the device. And you really have to get all these concepts together in order to see, okay, so this is actually, there's still some avenue of attack here. And I guess there's two situations to kind of split between.
Okay.
So one is the normal user access. You don't need admin access for that attack, and that's just lifting on the single sign-on session. So you can pretend to be Google Chrome. Google Chrome doesn't natively support single sign-on, so it calls on a helper application. You can call the same helper application, or you can perform some RPC operation, because of course it's Windows. So in the end, everything is tied together with some RPC caller or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you can just say, okay, I'm on this web page, which is a Microsoft login page, and I want a single sign-on. Please give me the token I need. And then the helper application will just call the right APIs. It will interact with the TPM, and it will get the cryptographic proof to get you signed in. So if you're an attacker in the same session as the user is, you can just kind of emulate that, or you can maybe even do it from Chrome and just follow that same flow, and then you obtain the token. So everything in Azure AD is done with JSON Web Tokens. And these JSON Web Tokens themselves, they're not, there's no certain ties to hardware anymore, because that will just be very complex. So these live in the application that requests them. And that means that they can also be taken from these applications, and you can transfer them to a different host and use them from there as the attacker itself.
That's the concept is one that I think gets overlooked a lot, especially when you're assessing the security of various systems. I see the most common corollary in at-rest encryption for things like databases, right? So the idea is that if something eventually accesses and decrypts it, well, then I don't care about getting the data directly. I'll just go to the broker that handles that interaction transparently for whatever applications end up needing it. So in this case, you found the helper application that Chrome uses, and it's perfectly fine to handle talking to the TPM for you. So you didn't need to, you don't need to like attach pin chips in and start reading things off of the chip. You just submit the request, right? Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. So the TPM protects it again in case I steal your laptop at night, break into your house, and then, well, I can't sign into your Azure AD account because it's protected in that TPM. But if you're actively using the computer, you're actively talking to the TPM and say, hey, please sign me into Azure AD, there's nothing which stops an attacker, which is in the exact same security context as you, from doing exactly the same thing.
Okay. And so, I mean, implicitly, you mentioned there's essentially a second case, right? So the first is if we're on the same session, we can essentially use the same session to request that user's cryptographic material, so the PRT in this case. What's the second scenario?
So if you're an administrator on the device and you're accessing with the highest rights, so that's system on Windows, there are two cases. So first case is if the cryptographic secret is not stored in a TPM, you can extract it from the system. That's shouldn't really be a surprise. I mean, it's not protected by hardware. It's somewhere in memory. It may be under 25 layers of encryption on disk, but if you follow the right path, if you spend enough energy on it, and I definitely did not do that, but Benjamin Delphi did all the hard work, and then he looked twice at Elsa's and was like, oh, it's here, and then the magic token comes out. So then you can just dump it from the system itself. Now, if it's in the TPM, then the actual secret is, of course, stored in the TPM. And you can't extract that unless you really focus on these hardware attacks or sniffing the bus or whatever, which is, well, just overly complicated. But it turns out that it's not like, okay, I want to sign, that Windows says, okay, I want to sign in to the TPM, and then the TPM gives you the token that you need to sign in. But there's like a kind of intermediate step. So it asks the TPM to provide a derived key, and then it uses the derived key to sign some data, and that is used to sign in. But if you have access to the machine once, you can just ask like 20 different derived keys and then use these whenever you want, because these are not time-based or something. So it's just the intermediate keys can be used to sign in on a different device and on a later date.
And they're valid.
So that's really something that surprised me as well.
Yeah, and they're just valid for forever.
I think they're valid as long as the primary refresh token is valid, which is 14 days.
Okay.
And if you keep signing in on your laptop, then it will automatically renew them for you. If you manage to steal them, you can still get access to the account, pretending to be on that laptop for like 14 days.
Wow.
So, I mean, obviously, Doug and I being in the incident response side of the house, one of the most common remediation techniques that we have is resetting passwords. If you execute this technique on a user's laptop, let's say you fished them and got a backdoor and you did this, and I reset their password, is that sufficient, or do I need to do more than that?
So in this case, you would need to do more. So these keys are tied to a device, and a device is an object in Azure AD. And as soon as you disable the device, then any policy that requires the user to be on a managed device or a compliant device, that will fail. So they can't use that key anymore.
And does that sort of failed back condition, does that require you have conditional access restricting managed devices? Or is there a situation that you could imagine where they don't have that conditional access requirement, and so that this protection doesn't work? Disabling the device wouldn't work. Or does it always work?
I think you can't use because the primary refresh token and the derived keys, they're always tied to a device. And if a device is disabled, these tokens don't work anymore. Okay.
Good to know.
And another important additional step, because this is talking about the primary refresh token, but in OAuth 2 terminology, there's also a regular refresh token. And the interesting thing is that so you can request a regular refresh token, which is tied to a specific application, and that one is valid longer than the primary refresh token. So, for example, when you're using Microsoft Teams on your desktop, you don't have to sign in every single morning. It doesn't even do single sign-on every morning because it has a long-term refresh token in its cache that it can use to obtain new access tokens for all the APIs that it accesses. But if you request a refresh token using the primary refresh token, that one is valid longer than the original primary refresh token.
Right.
So it's
90 days.
It's a bit weird.
Yeah.
Interesting. And are you aware of any granular way to dial these back, or is this just how it's designed? The fail limits, right? The duration of time that these are valid. Is there any way to change it?
I think you can do that with policies as well.
Okay.
But the important thing is, if an account is compromised, you can modify the property that says refresh tokens valid from. So if you set that to the current date, then any refresh tokens issued before that date are automatically invalidated.
Okay. So for those of you keeping track at home, password reset, disable device. For that user, you now need to invalidate refresh tokens by changing the from date to the current date. Am I following that correctly?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. There's
a command that automates that, and I think it's just called revoke refresh tokens or revoke OAuth 2 refresh token. That kind of does that backend change. You need to be like a global admin to do it, but it is in there. And it's basically like if you're on Facebook or whatever, and you see that button, like sign my session out from all devices, right? That's I think the equivalent.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Yeah. Really, really interesting stuff. I mean, have you used this on a red team before? And I'm assuming have not been detected, or is this more in the realm of this is a possible thing to do?
Well, if you do have a session on a user's device, then it's it's almost easier to just do that single sign-on than to keylog their passwords or try to dump it from memory, especially if there's some advanced monitoring. So this is something that could be monitored by EDR agents, but I haven't seen it happen yet. So it's easy, and the thing is also that if you're on a red team engagement and you're on a device and you're proxying things and you want to access a lot of data, that doesn't go very well over a proxy. So what you can do is you perform the actual sign-in on the user's device. So you comply with any requirements of IP address, and you comply with policies because it's from a managed device, and then you get the access token that's obtained, which is a very short-lived token. It's I think by default only 1 or 2 hours, but that access token, that after you have the access token, there are no checks anymore. So you can grab that access token, you move it to your virtual server somewhere with a fast internet connection, and then you just access all the data you want.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that changes with the, what do they call it? The continuous access evaluation that Microsoft has, right? So I think it's only on Exchange and SharePoint, but they're saying now every time you get a refresh token, they'll actually reevaluate the conditional access. So, if you had a policy, like you were saying, restricting logins to certain IP addresses, if you moved your refresh token and it reevaluated the policy, that might invalidate it. But maybe...
So every time you use the refresh token to obtain a new access token, then the policies are evaluated. If you move to a different IP address, it just says, no, you're not allowed to access it with this token from this IP address. But the access tokens themselves are, as far as I'm aware, there are no additional checks on that. I'm not sure because this continuous access evaluation keeps coming up, but I think that's something that has to be explicitly initiated from the client that you're using. It's at the moment it sounds like a voluntary thing and not necessarily something that they do on their backend or something to check if your access token is still valid.
Definitely something to look into. I know it's a very new feature that they're I think it's in preview anyway.
Right. And I think it's part of the general push towards sort of zero trust models of authentication, where now it's like anything you do, depending on how far it goes up the chain of, power and privileges, gets reevaluated, and you're basically asked to continually authenticate yourself for every action. So hopefully that will move this to a more manageable model, because just talking about the PRT alone, just this one issue, because there's several more in cloud security. We talked at great length about the ADFS, right? It's same idea. It's a way to bypass the traditional security monitoring, security restrictions, and validation model by basically shortcutting it through a service that was designed to shortcut it from the beginning. So hopefully that works better. So Turkhan, from your position, let's pretend I'm a Azure AD administrator, and I'm totally new to this, as a lot of Azure AD administrators are, because this is a very new thing to have to control. As far as PRT goes, is there something that we need to make sure that is turned on? Is there something that can be helpful to see this technique? What does the visibility of this look like from the perspective of a defender?
So it's in zero trust. It's moving it back to monitor the endpoint. So you really have to make sure that if you are trusting the endpoint and you're saying, okay, this user's identity is present on this endpoint, and we allow them very privileged actions only from this endpoint. And of course, you have to make sure that endpoint stays your endpoint and not the attacker's endpoint. So it's kind of a double-edged thing. You're moving more responsibility to the endpoints, but then you also have to heavily monitor those.
It's an interesting concept, because obviously when you're dealing with cloud environments, right, these hybridized environments, the endpoint is not necessarily a static thing anymore, right? You've got cloud instances spinning up and spinning down. You've got physical devices, but that's not necessarily the only place that you're administering these things from. Is there, from a cloud logging perspective, what would you see from an attacker using sort of the PRT in this way? Are there any, in the unified auditing log, is there anything that you would see there? Is this a logon that you would see? What generates a logon versus what doesn't?
Yeah, so it is a logon event if you use the PRT. Well, I think the hardest part to see is is this primary refresh token still on this device? So then you would really have to look at IP addresses, which are very hard to correlate, especially if people are traveling. Luckily, nobody's traveling at the moment, but so their home office should say the same, and otherwise maybe have a word with them. But it's a very hard problem to solve. So I think it's better solved by just making sure that you monitor the device, and if something strange happens to the device, then you disable the device until you figure out what's going on, and that invalidates that primary refresh token on the device as well.
And I think there's probably an education element involved as well with your SOC, right? Because I think you've mentioned here in your blog that those PRT tokens, they contain that device ID claim, right? So in the logs, it will say, even if I steal your PRT and I use it on my virtual host, the login will still say that it came from a managed device. Is that right?
Yes. So if you log in from Zimbabwe using your laptop that's supposed to be in the US, then that's fairly suspect, probably.
Yeah, so like an impossible travel alert. But I've actually seen an interesting case where the risky sign-in report from Azure AD, they've started adding machine learning to that to auto-remediate certain events. And one of the conditions for auto remediation, I don't think for impossible travel, but for they have another one that says atypical sign-in properties, like a new user agent or something like that. The engine will auto remediate it if there are certain things. So like if the claims and the tokens say MFA was provided, or I'm going to assume if the claims say the device passed device authentication, it may auto remediate some of those risky sign-in reports, which is, an interesting point to bring up potentially with the Microsoft teams, but also, as a security operator, you might not want to be super reliant on those, and make sure you really understand how your technology is happening, right? I didn't even know that there was auto remediation in the risky sign-in reports until very recently.
Yeah, there's some very interesting monitoring and automatic actions hidden away in the corners of Azure.
Yeah.
The other side of this is, of course, that maybe authenticating from a trusted device, which may not be a trusted device, is lowering the sign-in risk because it's from a trusted device. So it may pass even if there are unfamiliar sign-in properties.
That's a good point.
But I don't think this is something that people really need to worry about yet. I think they should stick with worrying from user passwords providing access to company data without MFA, and having a policy that only allows devices. It's already a big step in the right direction, and this is then the next step and the remaining risk. Like how much trusted are your devices? Yeah,
I think with just a few minutes left, I want to throw you a little bit of a curveball, hopefully not too much of an unusual question, but we see a lot of red teams that are involved with organizations that require MFA, but a lot of organizations have started allowing push notifications as your MFA, or a phone call is a really common option, right? And as a red teamer and also as an investigator, there are a lot of cases where the attacker got in from harvesting credentials and then sending a phone call to the user where all they need to do is press the pound key. So I'm curious your thoughts, like have you kind of seen that before on your engagements? And do you tell clients should we be telling clients to disable those options, or there's a weird balance that you have to play there between the usability and security. So I'm curious your thoughts.
Yes, I'm not much of a fan of the phone call option.
Yeah.
Actually, for my DEF CON talk last year, I did some trick where I recorded the sound of a pound button in my voicemail, and then the voicemail auto-approved the callback.
Wait, what?
Yeah, that was very. It's not very useful for anything, but the pound key is just it's a specific tone frequency.
Oh, right, yeah.
So usually you can't set the pound key as your voicemail message, because the pound key is also the thing from yes, I'm done with stating my welcome thing. But I used an app with my provider which allowed me to kind of just play that pound key sound and record it. And then Azure called me on my phone. I didn't pick up, so it went to voicemail. And then my welcome message was the pound key, and it approved the sign in. So I'm not much a fan of that. And a different reason I'm not a fan is it doesn't say anything. So it's just do you want to allow this or not? And if you have the push notification, it's I think it actually says that from here and here
IP address
on this device. So that gives you some more context. And I don't know if someone investigated how likely people are to just say yes if they didn't actually request a login. But that should be lower than just not doing it, right?
I would hope.
Right. Yeah, I think as a last note on that, just because I've seen it on the red teams that I was a part of many moons ago, it gets even worse whenever you are able to generate an event that would normally require a push request being accepted legitimately, and then you stack yours on top of it. And I know for a fact that there are people who, when they log in, are just like push, accept, because sometimes you get sent more than one, depending on how your logins are set up. So definitely an interesting area. I think we mentioned a long time ago in that two-factor talk we gave Doug about sort of getting someone to accept a fake one, and it actually being surprisingly successful. So, so I mean, wrapping up in terms of Azure AD, I mean, where are we, right? Like, what's your comfort level? Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction? Is there maybe a big question out there that you think the security community should be focused on answering? How do you feel comfort-wise about the work that you've done and how well it's been received and the changes that have been made?
I think we're definitely moving in the right direction, but I also think that we're not quite there yet. Yeah. I mean, the attackers are not doing all this advanced stuff because they don't need to. They still get enough money or access by just brute forcing winter 2020 or COVID 2020 to a lot of tenants. And even that is already hard to fight for some organizations. So as long as those are there, then, well, you can, of course, secure your organization and be better than the rest, but that doesn't fix it for everyone.
Right. What's next for your research? Any sneak peeks?
Well, at the moment, I'm trying to find some. I also was inspired by your talk. I'm looking a bit at legacy authentication and trying to find some ways around policies. Not success yet, but maybe there's something there, and always looking for new and interesting things. Yeah.
The logging is very interesting with legacy sign-ins as well. It's like,
I do have some stuff on that, but I'm not sure yet.
Stay tuned then. Well, Dirk-Jan, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Hope to have you back someday, and everyone stay tuned for Legacy Auth Oddities.
I think you just gave him a good title talk. All right. So to wrap it up, obviously, at this point, we're all in the swing of the holidays, and I hope that everyone has had a chance to look at the sort of the trend that we hope to start. So State of the Hack Gives Back on Twitter. If you're not familiar, many of us, myself very much included, are looking forward to holidays with, spending time with family, exchanging gifts, enjoying the creature comforts, a nice meal. But every year, especially at this time, and especially this year, there are millions of folks all around the world that are suffering from food insecurity. So cybersecurity and technology enjoy a special privilege as an industry because they are much less affected by the pandemic and the restrictions. We were much more easily able to adapt to working remotely, working from home, than many other industries, and it shows in terms of who's been primarily affected. Now, this privilege, as with all privileges, comes with a responsibility. So myself and the State of the Hack team this year wanted to make a push to encourage folks in their local communities, especially those who are part of the InfoSec community at large, to donate to their local food banks and help ensure that individuals without access or free access to food can get some, especially as the winter months soldier on here. If you believe that your community is in exceptional need of assistance from outside the community, all we ask is that you tweet a link to your local food bank or your location and the information that we can use to help provide that assistance, and just include the hashtag State of the Hack Gives Back. So just to be clear, this is by no means a corporate sponsored issue. This is just the folks that are part of the podcast team here. So myself, Doug, Evan, and Julian, as well as some of our guests, both former and future. We're trying to get people to make a push at the end of the year here in their local communities. And we want to make sure that for those communities that need extra help, we can help add in from the outside. So please feel free to tweet that out, include the hashtag, and the team here will do our best to spread the love as far as possible. So before we sign off, I do want to give a special shout out. I have a pretty cool Christmas present behind me. That is a special lamp that my wife made me. It's made from one of my favorite bourbons. Again, just try to end on a high note here. But so from the team, we hope that everyone watching has a pleasant holiday. And for those of you watching that are struggling this year, please know you are not alone. We are here with you, sending support digitally as much as we can. But that's it for 2020. Thank you guys, the audience, the team, everyone for their support. We love y'all, and we'll see you in the new year with a new episode.
In February.
Hosted by us in February, but hosted by Julian and Evan in January. So the State of the Hack team will be back for 2021. But otherwise, have a great end of the year. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you later.